The November wind cut through downtown Seattle like a blade, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something harder to name. Detective Sarah Mitchell pulled her patrol car to the curb outside the Pike Place Market, the radio crackling with routine calls that seemed to blur together after 12 years on the force. She'd seen enough broken lives scattered across city sidewalks to recognize the pattern: invisible people, invisible pain, invisible stories that most of the world walked past without a second glance. She almost drove past the bench herself. The woman sat hunched forward, her gray hair hanging like a curtain around her face, shoulders shaking with what could have been cold or something deeper. A torn shopping bag rested at her feet, its contents spilling onto the wet concrete. A few pieces of clothing, a water bottle, and something that caught the late afternoon light. Sarah had planned to make her usual circuit past the market vendors, checking in with the business owners who'd grown to trust her steady presence over the years, but something about the woman's posture made her pull over instead. As Sarah approached, her trained eye took in the details others might miss. The woman's coat, though dirty and worn, had once been expensive, wool blend with bone buttons that spoke of better times. Her shoes, scuffed and splitting at the seams, were quality leather underneath the grime, but it was her hands that made Sarah pause mid-step. Despite the dirt under her fingernails and the trembling that could have been attributed to withdrawal or cold, they were the hands of someone who had once cared deeply about presentation. Slender fingers that might have worn rings, nails that showed evidence of past manicures. "Ma'am?" Sarah said softly, crouching down to bring herself to the woman's eye level. "I'm Detective Mitchell. Are you all right?" The woman's head snapped up, revealing eyes that were startlingly clear despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. They were blue-green, the color of sea glass, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to war with resignation. For a moment, they stared at each other across a gulf that felt wider than the few feet between them. "I'm fine," the woman said, her voice carrying traces of an education that homelessness hadn't quite erased, just waiting for the rain to stop. Sarah glanced up at the gray sky that promised hours more of Seattle's November specialty. "Might be waiting a while. When's the last time you had something warm to eat?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched the woman's carefully constructed walls waver. Her stomach answered before she could, growling audibly enough to make her press a protective hand against her middle. "I don't take charity," the woman said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Not charity," Sarah replied, settling onto the far end of the bench, despite the dampness seeping through her uniform. "Conversation. I was about to grab coffee anyway, and I hate drinking alone. You'd be doing me a favor." Something shifted in the woman's expression, surprise perhaps at being treated as a person rather than a problem to be moved along. "I'm Margaret," she said finally, and the name came out like a confession. "Margaret Wells." Sarah extended her hand, noting how Margaret hesitated before taking it. Her grip was firm despite the trembling, and her skin carried the ingrained softness of someone who had known comfort before learning survival. "Nice to meet you, Margaret. There's a diner around the corner that makes decent soup. The owner, Joe, he's good people. You'd be safe there." The word safe seemed to resonate with Margaret in a way that made her shoulders straighten slightly. "I don't know if I should." "Tell you what," Sarah interrupted gently, "let me buy you lunch and you can tell me about those photographs you keep looking at. I saw you checking that bag like there's something precious in there." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to the shopping bag, and for the first time since Sarah had approached, she almost smiled. "How did you know?" "Because I'm a mother too," Sarah said, the guess based on nothing more than intuition and the protective way Margaret held that bag. "And because that's the look of someone who's carrying her whole world with her." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of city life continuing around their small bubble of connection. Vendors called out their wares, tourists laughed and pointed at the famous fish-throwing displays, and regular commuters hurried past with the single-minded focus of people who had warm homes waiting for them. But on this bench, in this moment, Two women sat in the space between strangers and something more, waiting to see which direction their brief intersection might take them. Margaret looked down at her hands, then back at Sarah's face, searching for something she seemed to find there. Detective Mitchell. Sarah. Margaret tested the name like she was remembering how to make connections. If I tell you something that might sound impossible, would you listen? Really listen? Sarah nodded, recognizing the moment when someone balanced on the edge of trust, ready to either jump or retreat. I'm listening. Margaret reached into her shopping bag with careful, reverent movements and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in what had once been a silk scarf. As she unwrapped it, Sarah saw a collection of photographs, their edges worn soft from handling. The top photo showed a little girl with Margaret's same sea glass eyes, maybe 6 years old, grinning at the camera with missing front teeth and pigtails that refused to stay neat. "This is Emma," Margaret said, her voice catching on the name. "My daughter. She'd be 32 now." Sarah looked at the photo, then at Margaret's face, doing quick math that didn't quite add up. The woman before her couldn't be much older than 50, which would have made her a teenager when this picture was taken. But before she could ask the obvious questions, Margaret continued. "She was taken from me when she was 7, not by strangers, by my mother-in-law, Helen Wells. My husband had just died in a car accident, and I was falling apart, drinking too much, sleeping too little, barely keeping our apartment. Helen convinced a judge that I was unfit, that Emma would be better off with her stable home and substantial bank account." Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the photograph with infinite gentleness. "The last thing Emma said to me was that she'd find me when she grew up. She promised we'd be a family again. Helen told her I didn't want to see her anymore, that I'd moved away and started a new life. But Emma, she said she'd remember my face, and she'd find me no matter what." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the November wind. "Margaret, how long ago was this?" 25 years, Margaret whispered. 25 years of waiting in the same city, hoping she'd come looking. I couldn't leave Seattle, because what if she came back and I wasn't here? But the years went by, and the jobs got harder to keep, and the apartments got smaller and cheaper, until... She gestured to the bench around them. Until there weren't any apartments at all. The story hung between them like a bridge Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to cross. It was the kind of thing she might have dismissed from another homeless person, chalked up to mental illness or drug-induced fantasy. But something in Margaret's clear eyes and careful way of handling those photographs made her lean forward instead of away. "Have you tried looking for her? Online searches? Social media?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "With what computer? What internet access? Detective, do you know what it's like to lose everything slowly, piece by piece, until you're invisible to the world? I've stood outside libraries in the rain for hours, waiting for a computer to open up. I've asked strangers to help me search, but who wants to help a homeless woman find her long-lost daughter? Most people cross the street to avoid making eye contact." Sarah found herself studying Margaret's face with new intensity, looking for signs of delusion or manipulation, and finding neither. Instead, she saw a mother's grief worn smooth by decades of carrying it, and a hope that had somehow survived, despite everything working against it. "What's Helen's full name? Your former mother-in-law?" "Helen Catherine Wells. She lived in Bellevue, in one of those gated communities. Probably still does, unless she's died. She'd be in her 80s by now." Sarah pulled out her phone, hesitating for just a moment before opening a search browser. The story was far-fetched enough to be either completely false or completely true, and something about Margaret's quiet desperation made her hope for the latter. The search results populated quickly, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Margaret," she said carefully, "Helen Catherine Wells died 3 months ago. There was an obituary in the Seattle Times." Margaret went very still, the photograph trembling in her hands. Did it mention Emma?" Sarah scrolled through the obituary, her heart pounding as she read. "It says she's survived by her granddaughter, Emma Catherine Wells Morrison, and her great-grandchildren, David and Sophie Morrison. Emma lives in Tacoma." The sound that came from Margaret might have been a sob or a laugh or something in between. She pressed the photograph against her chest and rocked slightly. Years of carefully controlled hope, suddenly threatening to overwhelm her completely. She kept Emma's name, Margaret whispered. She kept Wells in her name. Sarah was already opening a new search, her detective instincts taking over, even as her heart ached for the woman beside her. Emma Catherine Wells Morrison appeared in several results: a social media profile, a professional listing for a pediatric nurse at Tacoma General Hospital, and a local news article about a community health fair. "Margaret," Sarah said gently, "I found her. Emma is a nurse. She has 2 children. And," Sarah squinted at the screen, hardly believing what she was seeing, "she volunteers at homeless shelters on weekends. She's been doing it for over a decade." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, muffling a sound that was definitely a sob this time. "She's looking for me," she breathed. "All this time, she's been looking for me." Sarah stared at this social media profile photo of Emma Wells Morrison, noting the same sea glass eyes as her mother, the same intelligent expression. But what made her stomach clench was the About section of Emma's profile, which read, "Still searching for my mother, Margaret Wells, lost to me in 2000. If you knew her, please message me. I promised I'd find her." The rain had started again, a gentle mist that seemed to wrap around them like a blessing rather than a burden. Sarah watched Margaret clutch those photographs and felt something shift inside her chest, the feeling she'd learned to recognize as the moment when a case stopped being just a case and became personal. "Margaret," she said, her voice stronger now, "how would you feel about making a phone call?" Margaret looked up at her with eyes that held 25 years of accumulated hope and fear. "I don't know if she'd want to see me like this. I'm not the mother she remembers." "No," Sarah agreed gently. "You're the mother who never stopped waiting for her. The mother who stayed in the same city for 25 years because you made her a promise. That's exactly the mother she's been looking for." Around them, the city continued its relentless pace, but on this bench, time seemed to slow to accommodate the magnitude of what was happening. 2 lives that had been orbiting around an absence were suddenly, impossibly, about to collide with presence. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the grime on her cheeks. What do I say to her? How do I explain where I've been, what I've become? "You tell her the truth," Sarah said, "that you never stopped loving her, that you never stopped waiting, that every day for 25 years you hoped this day would come." She paused, looking at Margaret with new respect. "That you kept her promise even when it cost you everything else." Margaret nodded slowly, then looked at Sarah with something approaching wonder. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" Sarah thought about all the easy answers she could give: duty, compassion, the oath she'd taken to serve and protect. But sitting here with Margaret, watching hope rebuild itself in real time, she found herself reaching for something more honest. "Because everyone deserves to be found," she said, "and because I think you've waited long enough." The rain continued to fall, gentle and persistent, washing the city clean around them. In her shopping bag, Margaret carefully rewrapped the photographs in their silk scarf, but this time there was something different in the gesture. Not the desperate protection of someone guarding their only treasure, but the careful preparation of someone about to share it. Sarah dialed directory assistance, her heart hammering as she asked for the number of Tacoma General Hospital. When the operator connected her to the pediatric ward, she handed the phone to Margaret with steady hands. "Ask for Emma Wells Morrison," she said softly. "Tell them it's her mother calling." Margaret's hand shook as she took the phone, but her voice was clear when she spoke to the hospital receptionist. "Yes, I'd like to speak with Emma Wells Morrison, please. Tell her Margaret is calling. Her mother, Margaret." There was a pause that seemed to stretch for hours, filled with the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city around them. Then a voice came through the phone, tentative and trembling. Mom, is that really you?" Margaret closed her eyes and smiled through her tears. "Hello, sweetheart. I told you I'd be waiting when you found me." Sarah listened to the conversation that followed, halting at first, then rushing with 25 years of accumulated love and loss and hope. She heard Emma crying and Margaret crying and promises being made about meeting, about never being apart again, about grandchildren who would finally meet their grandmother. When Margaret finally hung up the phone, she turned to Sarah with a face transformed by joy. "She's coming," she said. "She's leaving work right now. She's coming to get me." Sarah helped Margaret gather her belongings, though she suspected they wouldn't be needed much longer. As they waited for Emma to make the drive from Tacoma, Sarah found herself thinking about the arbitrary nature of connection, how many times she'd driven past this bench without stopping, how close this reunion had come to never happening at all. "Detective Sarah," Margaret said suddenly, "I know this sounds impossible, but I feel like you were meant to find me today, like Emma somehow sent you." Sarah looked at this woman who had lost everything but her faith and promises, who had waited on street corners and park benches for a quarter-century because love had demanded that kind of patience. She thought about her own daughter at home, safe and warm, and never doubting that her mother would always be there to find her if she got lost. "Maybe she did," Sarah said, "or maybe this is what happens when someone refuses to give up on love, even when the whole world tells them to." When Emma's car pulled up to the curb 45 minutes later, Sarah watched a reunion that made her believe in the impossible. The woman who got out of the driver's seat had Margaret's eyes and her careful way of moving, but she also had something Margaret had lost, the confidence of someone who had never doubted she was loved, even when she couldn't remember by whom. Emma ran to Margaret without hesitation, without seeming to see the dirt or the torn clothes or the shopping bag full of possessions. She saw only her mother, the woman who had kept a promise across 25 years of silence. Sarah stepped back to give them privacy, but she couldn't stop watching as they held each other and cried and laughed and showed each other photographs. Margaret's worn pictures of a 7-year-old Emma, and Emma's phone full of images of the grandchildren Margaret had never met. "I volunteer at shelters," Emma was saying through her tears. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I knew you wouldn't have just left me. I knew you were still here somewhere." "I couldn't leave," Margaret replied, stroking her daughter's hair with hands that finally had something precious to hold. "I promised you I'd be here when you found me. I promised." As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah helped them load Margaret's few possessions into Emma's car. It struck her that everything Margaret had carried for 25 years fit into a single shopping bag, except for the love that had sustained her through every one of those days. "Thank you," Emma said to Sarah as she prepared to drive her mother home. "I don't know how to thank you for this." "Take care of each other," Sarah replied. "That's all the thanks I need." She watched them drive away, Margaret in the passenger seat, finally heading toward home, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as the reason she'd become a police officer in the first place. Not for the adrenaline or the authority, but for moments like this, when the world revealed itself to be more beautiful and more just than it usually pretended to be. As Sarah walked back to her patrol car, she thought about the reports she'd have to write, the paperwork that would try to capture what had happened on this bench. But she knew that no report could contain the real story, how love had stretched across 25 years of silence, how hope had survived on street corners and in shop doorways, how sometimes the most important police work had nothing to do with laws or regulations, and everything to do with recognizing that every person carried their own precious cargo of dreams and promises and unfinished stories. The radio crackled to life as she started the engine, dispatching her to another call, another person in need of help. As she pulled away from the curb, Sarah found herself hoping that somewhere in the city, other people were noticing the invisible ones, stopping to listen to their stories, believing in the impossible reunions that waited just beyond the next conversation. In her rearview mirror, she could see the bench where she'd first encountered Margaret, empty now except for the November rain and the memory of what had happened there. Tomorrow, someone else would sit on that bench, carrying their own burden of loss or hope or survival. And maybe, if Sarah was paying attention, she'd stop again. Because everyone deserved to be found. And because sometimes, if you listened carefully enough, you could hear the sound of promises being kept, even after 25 years of waiting. The rain continued to fall on Seattle, washing the streets clean and carrying with it the scent of new beginnings. Somewhere across the city, a mother and daughter were learning each other's faces again, filling in the gaps that time and circumstance had carved between them. And on the streets, in the shelters, in the forgotten corners where invisible people waited for their own miracles, hope persisted, stubborn and patient and absolutely, impossibly real. Sarah drove through the darkening city, her radio crackling with the endless stream of human need and crisis that defined police work. But for the first time in months, she found herself smiling as she responded to the next call. Today had reminded her why she'd chosen this work, why she'd committed herself to standing between order and chaos, between despair and possibility. Because sometimes, if you are lucky and paying attention and willing to believe in the impossible, you got to be present for the moment when someone's faith was rewarded, when promises made across impossible distances finally found their way home. The city sparkled in the rain around her, full of its usual mix of beauty and heartbreak, hope and desperation. But tonight, it also held the echo of a reunion, 25 years in the making, the sound of a mother and daughter choosing love over fear, choosing connection over the safety of solitude. And somewhere in Tacoma, Emma Wells Morrison was introducing her children to their grandmother, telling them the story of how love had waited patiently on a bench in downtown Seattle until the right police officer stopped to listen. It was the kind of story that would be passed down through generations, the kind that would remind them all that promises matter, that love endures, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary moments, when someone simply chooses to see the person behind the invisibility, to believe in the truth behind the tragedy. The night spread across Seattle like a blessing, and Detective Sarah Mitchell drove through it with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed grace in action, who had been allowed to play a small part in the grand, ongoing story of human connection